what a pleasure to introduce Larry Dossey to my old friend, Larry Dossey. Larry first spoke to the Mystics and Scientists Conference when it was a theme on the heart in 1993, along with Matthew Fox. And so that's 27 years ago. And he is an honorary member of the network. He's the author of many best-selling books, which I'm sure many of you have read, and particularly on the importance of prayer, the one mind, and precognition. And those last two topics are topics that he has spoken about at previous Mystics and Scientists, and his one mind was one of the book prize winners of its year. and so Larry is, it's about 9 o'clock in the morning for Larry, and he's looking quite perky to me. He's speaking from his home in Santa Fe. And I said yesterday, what an amazing thing, this possibility this is, that we're able to have one speaker in Scotland, one in Italy, one in Santa Fe, and one in Mallorca. And this is the enabling of the technology. So without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Larry for his talk, Consciousness and Healing, Death and Immortality, The Unfolding Vision. Doesn't sound quite comprehensive enough to me, Larry.
Well, David, I'll try to boil it down and make it very simple for you, okay? Well, it's quite an honor to be part of this conference. As David mentioned, I go way back with the Mystics and Scientists conference, and it's always an honor to participate in this conference because it's always high level, and it has an outstanding bevy of speakers. I want to talk about the events that are overtaking the world currently. Here in the United States, we have just been dragooned with this comment, we are all in this together. This comes out in many forms. I'll just show you some of those. The healthcare workers frequently chant this statement, we're all in this together. We even see this in marquees on movies these days, we're all in this together. Now please go and wash your hands. The Seattle area has this all over the place. This was one of the hotbeds of COVID-19 in this country. We're all in this together, just stay 6 feet apart. And this is the King County, Seattle, Washington Aging Society's comment. We're all in this together. You really cannot get away from this comment in this culture. I want to capitalize on this observation and say that this is more than a warning about how to avoid the coronavirus. I think that this is a spiritual impulse, this business that we can come together and that we can become a collective and a genuine unitary phenomenon that cannot be dissipated. This was the theme of my book, The One Mind, how our individual mind is part of a greater consciousness and why that matters. I think that it's smart to pause and circle back on some of these concepts that already come out in our conversation, such as spirituality, because if we don't get the definitions right, then I think that can lead to all sorts of misunderstanding. Here's how that works. Here's a man going down, drowning, and he says to his faithful dog on the shore, Lassie, get help. Well, Lassie does get help, but it's the wrong kind of help. So this man drowned because Lassie was confused about the meaning of help. We don't want to be confused about the meaning of spirituality or anything like that. And so I want to spend a little time saying what I mean when I use this term spirituality. I think this term conveys a sense of connectedness with something that is higher than the self or ego. And I think that this points to an absolute, immanent, or transcendent power, whatever name we give to that, whether it is God or a goddess or something else. And also, along with this definition comes the conviction that meaning and value and purpose are valid aspects of this universe that we inhabit. I want to maintain that spirituality has always been associated with healing, especially in terms of what we call healing intentions, willing or wanting or praying for a certain outcome to prevail. This is different from religion. Religion is a codified system of belief and worship and conduct. It may or may not including a sense of the spiritual. And religion usually takes place in a group of like-minded believers. I don't think we can talk about spirituality without bringing in the concept of the soul, which I take to be a spiritual or immaterial part of a human being or animal, which we regard generally as immortal. Now, you would have to have been asleep for the better part of a century to know that conventional science does not smile on ideas of the soul and spirituality. Conventional science tells us that there is no hereafter, that death is final, and that there's just simply no way around this. I think that health ought to include a vision of death in the hereafter. I don't think we can have health without bringing in concepts such as the soul. Well, I'm happy to have good company in this contention, among whom is Sogyal Rinpoche, who wrote the Tibetan Book of Living and Dying, who said, not to worry, we will all die successfully. And I'm fond of Montaigne's comment from the 16th century. If you don't know how to die, don't worry. Nature will tell you what to do on the spot, fully and adequately. She will do this job perfectly for you, so don't bother your head about it. Well, as a matter of fact, people, at least in this country, do bother their heads about this. This is a comment from Tom Ford, the famous fashion designer in New York. Death is all I think about. There's not a day or an hour that goes by that I don't think about death. So I'd be willing to say from my career as a physician that the fear of total annihilation with death has caused more suffering in human history than all the physical diseases combined. We were dragooned in this country in the 1970s by this Pulitzer Prize winning book, The Denial of Death. And Ernest Becker showed all of the ways that we have of denying that death is inevitable and final for everybody. Following the publication of this book, there was just an outpouring of comedic, lighthearted comments about the inevitability of death. Here's what the comedian Woody Allen had to say. He said, I don't want to achieve immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality through not dying. I don't want to live on in the hearts of my countrymen. I want to live on in my apartment. Well, I'm happy to quote Susan Ertz, who was a prolific British novelist, not too well remembered now, but in her day, she was really a prolific, wonderful writer. Susan said, millions long for immortality who don't know what to do on a rainy afternoon. Albert King is one of my favorite jazz guitarists and singers. Everybody wants to go to heaven, but nobody wants to die. So we see in these comments a really strong aversion to cessation of life on the planet. I don't think we could discuss this topic without bringing in the central question, does anything survive? One way of expressing this is to simply ask, is there a soul? And again, I would say that the soul is that spiritual or immaterial part of a human being or animal that is regarded as immortal. Now, there have been several approaches to crop up in cultures about this question. Some people find an answer to this question, is there a soul, in religion and scripture and faith and revelation. This is a totally adequate response to this question for a great many people. I don't gainsay this. I also observe that people relied on mediums for an answer. Also, near-death experiences are quite common in trying to find an answer about whether or not anything survives. We know in the United States currently that only about 16 million people have described near-death experiences, so they're not uncommon. People also talk about remembering previous lives, especially between the ages of 3 and 8 and younger children. And also, my favorite approach, however, has to be through what I just call consciousness research. And we'll get into this as we go forward. I want to suggest early on that this question of immortality is not just a matter of personal survival of human beings. It has become a matter of planetary survival as well. I would point once again to the comments of Sogyal Rinpoche. I have come to realize that the disastrous effects of the denial of death go far beyond the individual. They affect the whole planet. He said further, believing fundamentally that this life is the only one, modern people have developed no long-term vision. And what's the result of that? So there's nothing to restrain people from plundering the planet for their own immediate ends and from living in a selfish way that could prove fatal for the future. So this idea of immortality is not a lighthearted idea at all. I think it has to do with our physical perpetuation on the face of the earth. Carl Jung was one of the people who approached most decisively this question of immortality. Here's what he said. The decisive question for man is he related to something infinite or not? That's the telling question of his life. And Jung was so convinced of the importance of this question of immortality and the soul that he made this a principle in working with his clients. He said, a man should be able to say he has done his best to form a conception of life after death, or to create some image of it, even if he must confess his failure. Not to have done so is a vital loss. And so Jung said, as a doctor, I make every effort to strengthen the belief in immortality. So this involves us and the question of what are we talking about here? What is consciousness? What is it about consciousness that could survive as a soul? Well, conventional science has an answer to this, and it's that nothing survives. Consciousness and mind really are essentially the same thing as the workings of the brain, so that when the brain dies, consciousness and mind die with it, so that from the view of conventional science, nothing survives the death of the brain and body. Quotations affirming this point of view really are everywhere. Stephen Hawking had a go at this before he died a couple of years ago. He said, I regard the brain as a computer which will stop working when its components fail. There's no heaven or afterlife for broken down computers. That's a fairy tale for people who are afraid of the dark. Now, in the US, Marvin Minsky, who for many years was head of the Artificial Intelligence Lab at the Massachusetts Institute of Technology, was a very funny guy when it came to making light of this idea of the soul. He said, the brain is just a computer made out of meat. This triggered a lot of people chiming in, among whom was the Australian linguist Karen Stollsnow. Thinking is just the meat talking to itself. It's generated by the brain, and when we die, unfortunately, that dies with us. We can state that categorically. Don't you just love the presumptuous certainty that some of these skeptics weigh in on this question with, that we can state this categorically, no doubts whatsoever. So that the message from conventional science is that there is no direction or purpose or meaning in the universe at all. We're kidding ourselves if we find meaning. David Lindley, the astrophysicist, we humans are just crumbs of organic matter clinging to the surface of one tiny rock. Cosmically, we're no more significant than mold on a shower curtain. Daniel Dennett has been one of the most vociferous critics of the endurance of human consciousness following death. He's a philosopher at Tufts University. He says, we're all zombies. Nobody is conscious. I'd like for you to pause just a moment and unpack this, because if what he says is correct and nobody is conscious, that certainly includes himself. So if Daniel Dennett is unconscious and everybody is a zombie, then it is a real question whether we should pay any attention to what he is telling us. If I had to summarize the message which most of us get from conventional science, it would be this: mind equals the brain. You're your body and nothing more. So that when your body dies, all that is you dies with it, so that absolutely nothing survives. Well, there are problems with this conventional scientific point of view, or we wouldn't be having this conversation. Stuart Kaufman, who is one of the leading theoretical biologists in the US, says this: nobody has the faintest idea what consciousness is. I don't have any idea, nor does anybody else, including the philosophers of mind. Donald Hoffman is a cognitive scientist at the University of California, Irvine. The scientific study of consciousness is in the embarrassing position of having no scientific theory of consciousness. Freeman Dyson, who is one of our leading physicists, philosophers at Cornell, the origin of life is a total mystery, and so is the existence of human consciousness. Now, I'm not saying that people who have this point of view are correct, but I am saying that the question is open, and we ought to look for evidence elsewhere before we conclude that nothing survives physical death. Dyson goes on to say, we have no clear idea how the electrical discharges occurring in nerve cells in our brains are connected with their feelings and desires and actions. Steven Pinker has been one of the most severe critics of the existence of a soul and survival. And even Pinker says, as to the question of how consciousness could arise from a physical brain, beats the heck out of me. I have some prejudices, but I have no idea of how to begin to look for a defensible answer, and neither does anyone else. So I think we're justified in asking how on earth, in view of this negative approach from conventional science, how could we justify a belief in our immortality at an age in which it is totally denied? Let's begin with the 20th century project of taking the mind apart. we divided the mind into several categories in the 20th century, into the conscious, the unconscious, the preconscious, the subconscious, the ego, the id, and the superego. And I want to suggest that we've been looking through the wrong end of the telescope. I contend that it's possible to put the mind back together, in which we honor not just its parts, but we honor also its collective aspects. I think that there is an emerging science that leads to a view that consciousness is non-local. And when we use that word non-local, if you just want to ignore the word non-local and insert the word infinite, then you will catch the meaning of the word non-local. And so when we use the term non-local mind, we're talking about mind that is infinite. We're talking about consciousness being without any boundaries whatsoever in space and time. And so here's the territory of non-local or infinite mind. If something is infinite, it has no boundaries, right? Therefore, without boundaries, it comes together as a unity and as a oneness. If something is infinite in space, it's everywhere in space, meaning that it's omnipresent. If something is infinite in time, it's eternal and it's immortal. So if somebody wants to jump off and say that mind is non-local, they're really saying quite a bit. They're saying that mind is eternal, omnipresent, immortal, and unitary, or one. So an additional part of the argument is simply the plain fact that consciousness can do things that brains are incapable of. Consciousness can function non-locally, defying boundaries in space and time. Therefore, consciousness cannot be the same thing as the local brain. Now, people were on to this idea a long time before physicists came up with this term non-locality, among which was Carl Jung, of course, who talked about the collective aspects of the mind, how the mind is not confined to individuals, but functions beyond them. This has never been a mystery to great poets, among whom was Yeats, who said that the borders of our memories are shifting, and our memories are part of one great memory. He went on to say that the borders of our minds are ever shifting, and many minds can flow into one another and create or reveal a single mind, a single energy. Well, one of the things that has really added to the excitement of this idea of collective consciousness has been physicists themselves. And if I had to name a hero of mine in modern physics, it would have to be Erwin Schrödinger, because he didn't hold back about speculating about the unification of consciousness. Schrödinger said that consciousness is a singulare tantum, a singular entity. To divide or multiply consciousness is something absolutely meaningless. He went on to say, there's obviously only one alternative, namely the unification of minds or consciousness. And this is the stunner for me. He said that the overall number of minds is just one. In truth, there is only one mind. Well, Schrödinger was one of the greatest minds of the 20th century. Why on earth would he arrive at the idea that there is only one mind? Well, he wasn't alone. Years later, along came David Bohm, who took this idea and ran with it. Here's what Bohm had to say. If we don't establish these absolute boundaries between minds, then it's possible they could unite as one mind. Deep down, he went on to say, the consciousness of mankind is one. This is a virtual certainty. And if we don't see this, it's because we're blinding ourselves to it. Well, long before these couple of physicists weighed in on this was the great essayist and philosopher Ralph Waldo Emerson, who said essentially the same thing. There's one mind common to all individual men, a universal mind. The oversoul, which was Emerson's term for this collective consciousness, the oversoul is that unity within which every man's particular being is contained and made one with all others. Within man is the soul of the whole, the eternal one. If you have trouble grabbing onto these quotations and you want to record them, you can just go to my book, One Mind, in which you'll find them. So I think that we are arriving at the point where we can talk about a new kind of science, which goes beyond that conventional science that we looked at earlier, which denies soul or immortality, in which we're willing to say that consciousness is not the equivalent of the brain. Consciousness may work through the brain, but it is not produced by the brain and cannot be explained by the workings of the brain. This is kind of a review of the landscape of people who have maintained essentially the same thing. And if you wanted to distill what these people have said, I think it might be reducible to this. The brain transmits consciousness so that it is in essence a transmissive organ, but it is not a productive organ. It does not manufacture or create the brain. And many people who have maintained this have been speakers at the Mystics and Scientists conference over the years, and which, David, I'm sure you will recognize a lot of these folks who really have left their tracks in your organization. So I want to say that consciousness operates through the brain, but it isn't produced by it. And so that the brain transmits consciousness much as a prism transmits light and refracts it into the different colors of the visible spectrum. But the prism does not make the light. And so one of my favorite concise quotations is from David Darling, who's an astrophysicist. He wrote the book Soul Search, who says that we're conscious not because of the brain, but in spite of it. Max Planck, who happened only to found quantum physics, seemed to agree. I regard consciousness as fundamental, he said. I regard matter as derivative from consciousness. We cannot get behind consciousness. He said, everything that we talk about, everything that we regard as existing postulates consciousness. And so for Planck, then, consciousness was the beginning of everything that we know, everything that we perceive. I think it's interesting, having used the word non-locality of consciousness, to inquire about what these non-local events happen to look like in real life. I mean, how can we go about recognizing that a consciousness event behaves non-locally? Well, I believe that evidence for non-local unity and oneness leads to considerations of spirituality. And spirituality, if you look closely, has become an essential factor in health and wellness. Now, this has really become a hot topic in modern medicine, which a lot of people have not caught on to yet. Here's what we know. Here's what the best science shows us in terms of health and illness. We know from scores of studies that those who follow some sort of spiritual or religious path, and I have to say, it doesn't seem to matter greatly which path they choose, but if they choose one and they stick with it, on average, they live 7 to 13 years longer than people who do not follow such a path. And here's the kicker. They have a lower incidence of all the major illnesses that kill people during their spiritual journey. But there are exceptions. Spirituality doesn't always guarantee good health. And so years ago, I made a long list of highly spiritual people who died of horrible diseases. One was Saint Bernadette, who died in her early 30s of some terrible illness. It may have been bone cancer, but we don't know for sure. Another was Ramana Maharshi, who died of a severe cancer, which was quite painful. And also, if you go back and read the history, you discover that the Buddha died of food poisoning. Why would these people who were very saintly and highly spiritual and God realized, why did they die of these horrible diseases? Well, we don't know. But the bottom line is that spirituality does not always mean good health 100% of the time. Now, if you take that koan and you flip it over, what you get is the opposite. You don't get people who are spiritual who die of horrible diseases. You get unspiritual people who live forever, and they apparently never get sick. They don't live forever, but they live long lives. And in spite of horrible health habits, they thrive. I call these people healthy reprobates. I think every family has one or two of these floating around somewhere, right? We're reluctant to talk about them because they're kind of an embarrassment, really. Here are two examples, and I hate to say this, but these were residents of London, both of these young ladies, and here they are celebrating their 100th birthdays, and every time they'd have a birthday, the British press would go out and interview them. What's your secret? What do you attribute your long, healthy life to? And obviously the woman on the left is a smoker, and the woman on the right is a smoker and a drinker. She has some drink in her left hand. So how do we count for these anomalies? The point is that they're not anomalous. They're not anomalous. There are plenty of these people, and any model that we make of health and illness has to account for them. In spite of this, we have stories that continue to surface more frequently than ever before of people who are healed through spiritual interventions. One of my favorite recent published books is by Dr. Scott Kolbaba, who lived in the Wheaton, Illinois area in the center of the United States. And Dr. Kolbaba did something that I've never heard any doctor do. He went around and he inquired of all of the doctors on the hospital staff, I want you to write up the most amazing healing story you've ever been connected with. And the doctor said, that's hard to do because we don't like to talk about these things. And so that's the whole point of the book. What is it that stuns doctors? And so he named this book Physicians' Untold Stories because they never talk about them. But he finally got enough of these stories that he went into publication with this book. So 26 physicians reveal these stories. Here's one of them. This is the the story of Barbara Comiskey, and it was contributed by Dr. Thomas Marshall, who was an internist at this hospital. And here's briefly a thumbnail sketch of what happened. Barbara, as a young woman, was a flute player and a gymnast in high school in Wheaton, Illinois. But at the onset, by the age of 15, she had the onset of multiple sclerosis. This was a galloping illness. Although she managed to graduate high school, she began college, but she had to drop out because of increasing disabilities. This was a severe illness. It nearly killed her as a young person. She had 2 respiratory arrests in the early 70s in which she just stopped breathing. She was resuscitated. She went on to be recurrently hospitalized because of pneumonia. She had a collapsed lung in 1980. This got worse. She had a tracheostomy and oxygen therapy continually. Thereafter, she lost control of her bowel and her bladder. She underwent catheterization, and she had an ileostomy. She became legally blind. She lost her vision. Before all of this happened, she was religious, but then she lost her faith. As the years wore on, she became bedbound and she became like a pretzel. She developed severe contractures in bed. She assumed a permanent fetal position. She couldn't swallow any longer, so she had a feeding tube put into her stomach from the outside. By 1981, things got so bad that she was given 6 months to live, and she was enrolled in hospice care. And her family and her doctor got together and felt and agreed to the fact that she was so far gone that when she died, there would be no heroics to try to resuscitate her, no CPR, and so on. Well, something happened in this little town on June 7th, 1981. Her story was aired through a local radio station, WMBI, and prayers were solicited for her and for other people in the radio listening community who were also terminally ill. We know that there was an overwhelming response because the radio station received bags of letters later. And so here's what happened. She had a couple of girlfriends who were in attendance in her room the afternoon where this prayer solicitation was going on. And Barbara says that she heard a voice, and the voice was a man's voice, and it said to her, "My child, get up and walk." She did. Her interpretation was that God was speaking to her. So this woman who was pretzeled up, unable to stand, with several tubes dangling, jumped out of bed and removed her oxygen. And for the first time in years, she stood upright on her own legs. Her vision came back. She was no longer short of breath, off of oxygen. And her mother heard this ruckus in her bedroom and walked in and looked her up and down, and apparently her body had changed. Her mother said, "You have muscles again." Her father came into the room and grabbed her and waltzed her around the room. And it was apparent that something inexplicable had happened. Nobody could get their minds around this. They decided they ought to go back to church that night. They did. Everyone was shocked because everyone knew this girl was about to die. And among the shocked people was the minister. Observers said that he fell against the pulpit. He could not stand up himself, and he kept saying, "This is nice. This is very nice." Well, everybody disbanded. They went back home. And the next day, they took Barbara to see her old doctor, Dr. Thomas Marshall, who, just to remind you, contributed to this story, to this book. And this is what he wrote. "I thought I was seeing an apparition. Here was my patient, who was not expected to live another week, totally cured. I stopped all her medication and took out her bladder catheter, but she wasn't quite ready to have her tracheostomy tube removed until another visit." And here's the understatement. "Nobody had ever seen anything like this before." He went on to say this, "That afternoon we sent Barb for a chest x-ray. Her lungs were now perfectly normal, with a collapsed lung totally expanded, with no infiltrate and no abnormality that had existed before. I have never witnessed anything like this before or since." He went on to add, "Barbara has gone on to live a normal life in every way. She subsequently married a minister and feels her calling in life is to serve others." Now, if you go onto the internet and you plug in her name, you will find this story written up on the internet, so you can access it yourself. I want to add one other case which I was peripherally involved with, and this was the case of Anne O'Neill. And when this case got started, then Anne O'Neill was 4 years old. She suffered from acute lymphocytic leukemia. She was hospitalized at the University of Maryland in Baltimore, and this was 1952. And at that time, she was under the care of Dr. Milton Sachs, who was one of the most famous oncology doctors in the United States. Well, her illness was 100% fatal at the time. Nobody in the history of medicine had ever survived this terrible disease, acute lymphocytic leukemia. So, not surprisingly, this little girl was dying in the hospital. She was given last rites, and her grandmother had sewn a burial gown for Anne to be buried in. So this young mother of Anne O'Neill was asked by the nurses, "Are you ready to give her up?" Her feisty mother said, "No, I am not." She bundled up this little girl, and with the help of several nuns at the hospital, they took her out to the local cemetery. And they laid her on the tomb of Mother Elizabeth Seton, who happened to be buried there as a Catholic nun, around whom several miracles had been associated with this nun. And so after laying Anne on her tomb, they prayed for a healing. And then they bundled this little girl up and took her back to the hospital. In a few days, something strange happened. All of her blood tests proved to be normal. Apparently, she had no peripheral blood signs of acute lymphocytic leukemia. This proved to be permanent. She was discharged from the hospital, and she was reported to the hierarchy in the Catholic Church as a possible miracle. They didn't do any hasty declarations, but they waited 9 years to see if this would last. And then they performed a bone marrow biopsy, which proved to be normal. They were looking for residual leukemia cells. They didn't find anything. And so finally, after about 10 years, she was declared a miracle by the Catholic Church. Years and years later, Tamara Jones, who was a reporter for the Washington Post, got hold of this case in 1994, and she did something unusual. She contacted Dr. Milton Sachs, who was by that time famous, and he declared that her disease was indeed uniformly fatal. Up until this time, nobody had ever survived acute lymphocytic leukemia. And so Tamara Jones, the reporter, said, "Why didn't you write this case up?" And he had not written the case up. And he confessed, and I think this is an admirable confession. He said, "The only reason this case has not been written up is that I have been afraid to." Afraid of what? I think we can say that he was afraid of the repercussions for his reputation. One doesn't want to become the first person in the history of medicine to write up a cure for a disease that responded to prayer. That was what he was afraid of. Well, I was asked by Tamara Jones, did I think that there was any way that this could possibly have happened? By that time, I had been knee-deep in tracing down cures attributed to prayer, so I gave her a yes answer. She published this in the Washington Post in April of 1994. And so Ann O'Neill has gone on to become a cosmetologist in the Baltimore area. You can look up her case as well on the internet. This leads into what I want to cite as one of the most convincing episodes that our consciousness can transmit its contents to other people non-locally. These are called telesomatic events. Telesomatic is from the Latin, meaning distant body. And here's the one that initially caught my eye. It was a case involving four-year-old identical twins in northern Spain, which occurred in 1976. Their names were Sylvia and Marta Landa. And here's what happened. One day, the father was going to visit his mother, the grandmother of these little two girls, and he invited them to come. One little girl decided to go with him, and one little twin girl stayed home to help her mother do chores. Doing chores, she touched a red-hot iron and erupted suddenly in a blister like the one you see here on this hand. And at the same time, the little girl who went to see the grandmother, who was several kilometers away, erupted at the same time on the same hand, the same shape with the blister. She was carried to the doctor. This was photographed. There was no, so this was suitably recorded. And the twins became famous. This was written up in the local paper. The psychology department at the University of Seville got wind of this, and they dispatched a team of psychologists to go and investigate what in the world had happened. Well, they took these little girls and interviewed them. They found out on the review of literature that these events are not all that uncommon. They occur in about 20% of identical twins. And the twins have a particularly intimate relationship with others, with the other twin. They enjoy being twins. Here are a couple of young London twin boys. They're making fun of this connectivity that goes between each of them with these tinfoil helmets here. I think on reviewing this, it's pretty obvious to pick out twins who have these telesomatic events. These are two little girls who show up on the internet. They look like great candidates for the telesomatic events to occur because they enjoy being twins. I'll tell you, all identical twins don't enjoy being identical. They have problems developing personalities and so on. So it's not axiomatic that they love being identical. These events occur mostly in twins who are emotionally close. They occur also between parents and children. They occur between spouses and siblings and lovers also. If you want to look at the go-to book about this psychic connection between twins, here's a book by Guy Playfair, who was a British investigator of this sort of thing, Twin Telepathy. This is a wild book. If you have doubts about this twin telepathic connection, this ought to affirm it. Here's why I'm interested in this. I'm an identical twin. This is my brother and me at a young age. My mother would be very happy to know I'm showing the baby pictures here. But this is Gary and Larry. We were kind of split between whether or not this was a fun thing to be identical or not. So we did have a very low incidence of these telesomatic events. They aren't totally absent from us. We have experienced these, but not commonly. I'm married to a twin. This is Barbara, my wife, and her brother at a very young age. They're fraternal twins, and they have had these telesomatic events in spades. I'll not kid you, that just put my brothers in my record to shame. These are not just mental, they're profoundly physical as well, and they exist at the cellular level also. Let me tell you that this has stunned people who have looked at this at the laboratory. And they have gone down to the level of the brain to figure out if brains behave like this. And so what you have are people who've been wired up with EEGs and separated at a great distance. And there are about a dozen of these experiments that are on the record now. When you stimulate with, say, a bright light, one of these brains, the other brain lights up in the same way on the EEG recording, so that you know that the stimulus somehow has gotten through at the brain level of these twins. And it isn't twins who have been investigated. People who have emotional closeness, like lovers, have been investigated with these distant EEG recordings. Researchers have been content not only to look at how whole organs respond simultaneously at a distance, they have taken this down to the level of human neurons. And when neurons have been extracted, say from brains, and put at a distance, when you stimulate one neuron, the distant neuron also registers the stimulus. This has been done by Rita Pizza and her colleagues at the Diabet Laboratory and the University of Milan at Italy. What they did is to take distant neurons and to stimulate one batch of neurons with a laser light so that the other batch of neurons at a distance lights up as well. Well, this is sensational stuff. Here's what Pizzi says. When one group of human neurons is stimulated with laser light, a distant group of neurons register the same changes, although both are shielded, bypassing almost all known forms of physical communication. Well, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration got hold of this research, and that's why this research is now on the internet at the Smithsonian and NASA Astrophysics Data System. There's the lab, the internet address if you'd care to copy it. She says that our experimental data seem to strongly suggest that biological systems present non-local properties not explainable by classical models. So when we hear COVID-19 researchers say, we're all in this together, I think that this is going beyond a kind of unity that would even shock the people who are making these COVID-19 proclamations. This sort of research never seems to end. It's been taken farther by Ashkan Farhadi and his colleagues at the Rush University Medical Center in Chicago. What they did was to take epithelial cells, separate them at a distance, and when they would poison one batch with hydrogen peroxide, the same batch at a distance registered the same changes. So I want to take this research back to the physicists and the philosophers, specifically to Aldous Huxley, who happens to be one of my favorite authors. Each one of us is potentially mind at large, but insofar as we are animals, our business at all costs is to survive. To make biological survival possible, mind at large has to be funneled through the reducing valve of the brain and the nervous system, so that what comes out at the other end is a measly trickle of the kind of consciousness that will help us to stay alive on the surface of this particular planet. Arthur Koestler began to think about this. Here's what Arthur said. We are peeping Toms at the keyhole of eternity, but at least we can try to take the stuffing out of the keyhole, which blocks even our limited view. If we were to remove the stuffing from the keyhole, that is to say, if we were to unblock the filter that is our brain, what do we experience? I think we come up against our non-local nature. And I want to cite as proof evidence from creativity. If you begin to think about a collective consciousness with which each individual is connected, which is one of the derivative thoughts from saying that consciousness is unified, then we can begin to think about a pool of intelligence that might be tapped by people who are creative, who have learned how to do this, to go beyond the individual. As Emerson said, there is one mind common to all individual men. What Plato has thought, he may think. What a saint has felt, he may feel. What at any time has befallen any man, he can understand. Who hath access to this universal mind is a party to all that is or can be done. One of the people who seem to have been able to do this is Thomas Edison, the greatest American inventor. People say, I have created things. I've never created anything. I get impressions from the universe at large and I work them out. But I'm only a plate on a record or a receiving apparatus. Thoughts are really impressions that we get from the outside. This has never been a mystery to many great musicians. Here's what Mahler had to say. He wrote a letter to his friend about his composition of his Third Symphony in 1896. And he said, my symphony will be something that the world has never heard before. I tell you, at certain places in the score, a quiet, uncanny feeling takes possession of me. And I feel as if I had not created this myself. I want to relate with you a passage from Joseph Chilton Pearce, his book, The Evolution's End, which sort of brings this down in age to some of the people who seem to have no trouble going there. It has to do with the young children. Here's what Joseph Chilton Pearce had to say. When he was in his early 30s, he was teaching humanities in college. And as he puts it, he was engrossed with the nature of the God-human relationship and the psychology of Carl Jung. And he was totally obsessed with the topic. And his reading on the subject was extensive. And as he was preparing for an early morning class at college, he was in his bed, and his 5-year-old son came into the bedroom, sat down on the edge of the bed, and launched into a 20-minute discussion on the nature of God and man. And here's what Pearce said. My 5-year-old son spoke in perfect publishable sentences without pause or haste and in a flat monotone. He used complex theological terminology, and he told me it seemed everything there was to know. As I listened, astonished, the hair rose on my neck, and I felt goosebumps. And finally, tears streamed down my face. I was in the midst of the uncanny, the inexplicable. His son was 5. My son's ride to kindergarten arrived, horn blowing, and he got up and left. I was unnerved, and I arrived late to my class. My son had no recollection of the event. Well, I want to close by talking about what I think are some unavoidable ethical issues that concern this idea of the one mind. If we're all connected, then there's always a collective, global aspect to what we refer to as personal health. So that if there's anything to what we've looked at, personal health is never just personal. If conscious is unitary, then the health of one person affects the health of everybody else. So that the health of this little Western baby on the left is never totally distinct from the health of these 3 children on the right. There are 3 children on the right. The little girl is holding a baby. You may not be able to tell. So individual health choices reverberate non-locally at every level we can think of. The individual, the societal, and the global, and they overlap. This suggests that we could expand the golden rule, which in its usual form says, do unto others as you would have them do unto you. We could rejig that and elevate it to something like this. Be kind to others because in some sense, they are you. Ramana Maharshi was asked at one point in his teachings, how should we treat others? And he responded, there are no others. So I want to suggest to you that our survival on this planet likely depends on whether or not we perceive our unity or not. And the key realization, it seems to me, is that we're non-locally connected not only with one another, but with all sentient life. And when we deeply realize this, all of life becomes sacred and precious and worth saving. So this idea, this concept of the unitary one mind, by fostering love for all of sentient life and for the earth itself, just might assist our own survival. And so in the end, I want to suggest to you that our survival is all about love. Schweitzer said, what we call love is in its essence reverence for life, and it includes all living beings. Again, poets have been all over this. W.H. Auden said, we must love one another or die. Alice Walker, the American novelist, chimed in, anything we love can be saved. Let me summarize. I believe intensive love reveals that consciousness is non-local. That is to say, consciousness is non-local or infinite in space and time. And if it's infinite in space and time, it's eternal and immortal and one. And so the evidence for non-local mind not only permits immortality, it absolutely requires immortality. So that immortality is not merely optional, it is absolutely mandatory. The implications is that immortality isn't acquired. We don't gain it as we move through life. Immortality has no beginning and it has no ending. It does not kick in with physical death. It is always present. This has implications. We're all immortal right now. Aldous Huxley, my hero. Let me give you the background of this comment. Huxley was dying at his house in Southern California. He was by this time quite famous. People had gathered. The people elected an emissary to go back to the bedroom where Huxley was doing his dying. And they asked him, do you have any advice for those of us who will be left behind? Here's what he said. People often ask me what is the most effective technique for transforming their life. It is a little embarrassing that after years and years of research and experimentation, I have to say that the best answer is just be a little kinder. Henry James, the great novelist, the brother of William James, the father of American psychology. Henry wrote, 3 things in human life are important. The first is to be kind. The second is to be kind. And the third is to be kind. In the 14th century, Hafiz, the Persian poet, said, let's go deeper, for if we do, our spirits will embrace and interweave. Our union will be so glorious that even God will not be able to tell us apart. I want to tip my hat to the coronavirus. If we gain anything from this pandemic, I hope it is this realization that has already become inescapable. We're all in this together. This is the message that we have gained from research on consciousness, that it is non-local, that is that it is infinite in space and time, that it has no boundaries, and that it is unitary, collective, and one. Thank you.
Well, Larry, what a tour de force. A beautiful presentation, comprehensive, scientific, mystical, based in experience, with ethical implications, really inspiring. And I suddenly realized that I thought I was on mute, but because I wasn't on mute, you would probably have heard my dogs barking downstairs during the meeting.
Actually, I did not hear them, but if I had heard them, it would have been a good thing. I think they would have added a different dimension.
Good.